The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. The webinar will begin in about 2 minutes. Okay, so let's get started. Good morning and welcome to this month's SNOP Agility webinar hosted by Steelwedge Software. Our topic today is to discuss about key metrics to supercharge your demand management and SNOP process. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Kaushal Dave, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. We'll just get started in a few minutes, but before we do, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded and will be emailed to you after the webinar to review or share with your colleagues. We encourage you to interact with our speakers, so feel free to post your questions at any time during the webinar in the question box within the side panel at the right of your screen. We'll do our best to address them in the Q&A at the end of the hour. With that, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Today, we are delighted to welcome Steelwedge's own Vice President of Solution Design and Analytics, Rick Blair. Rick has over 25 years of experience in supply chain consulting and operations management. At Steelwedge, Rick works directly with customers and team members to optimize solution design, drive improvements, and apply best practice methodologies. Rick will also take part in the interactive Q&A session during the last 10 minutes of the hour. Thanks to our presenter again, and all of you today for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started by passing the presentation over to Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Kaushal. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties right off the bat in getting the slide deck to advance forward. Bear with me here. Trying to get this fixed. There we go. So unfortunately, you didn't get to see the beautiful slide with my mugshot on it. So there you go. We'll keep moving forward past that. Thank you for having me today, and everyone for joining. Really appreciate your time and the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. What I plan to cover today is a focus on measuring forecast accuracy and how tracking that performance can have a significant impact on SNOP and IBP processes. And specifically, I want to go through why companies measure forecast accuracy, look at what is the benefit in doing that, both for individuals and more importantly for companies. Also talk about some of the examples of forecast accuracy metrics and what are the typical ways to measure forecast accuracy. Then I want to look at an example of how MAPE is calculated. I know that there are probably a lot of people who already know that information, but for those who don't, and I've found that there are a fair number of people who actually use MAPE or other kinds of forecast accuracy measures that aren't really exactly sure how it's calculated, I think it's important for us to go through some of the basics about how to calculate those accuracy measures and understand how the values can be manipulated. And maybe that's even more important than strictly the mechanics of how it's calculated, but how some people who are measuring forecast accuracy are able to use those values to their benefit, but maybe not to the benefit of the company as a whole. And then we'll take that a few steps further and look at some of the key considerations in designing the way you measure forecast accuracy. There are several factors to consider when you set up that forecast accuracy metric, and so I want to cover some of those key decisions that you need to make and be aware of in the way that forecast accuracy is measured. And then lastly, we'll look at a couple of examples of forecast accuracy reports from SteelWedge and how we pull in some of those metrics and make them visible for users. So right off the bat, let's talk about what is forecast accuracy. It's always good to start with a definition. So from my perspective, forecast accuracy is simply the deviation or the difference or the error between the plan and actual. So the less that deviation, the smaller the error, the greater the accuracy. So that's probably self-evident to most people, but it's an important distinction. And it's really, forecast accuracy it's not that complicated. So if we keep that in mind, that what we're really looking for is trying to minimize that error. Error is our enemy. So the goal is to predict the future as close as possible, but we always have to remember that we're never going to be perfect. I shouldn't say never. Sometimes we can hit it right on the nose, but most of the time we're gonna have a forecast and actual that don't match, and that's okay. That's expected, but we need to get as close as we can possibly be. So there are certainly degrees of being wrong, and we want to make that wrongness as small as possible. Let's talk about what are the reasons, or what motivates an organization to track accuracy. Why even put in the effort to look at what happened in the past? Well, one option is, or one motivation would be to hold individuals or groups accountable for this. Make sure that they feel that this is something that's important, that by tracking it, that the company recognizes its importance, and you can use that to reward high performance. Also, companies may use this to benchmark against other companies to be able to determine if additional effort or funding is needed in order to meet or exceed what competitors are doing. One other option is to manage inventory levels, to use forecast accuracy to drive what inventory levels are set. And then lastly, improve management of business, which really means how do we take what we've learned and push it back into our S&OP and IBP processes to really improve the way we manage our demand planning process. So with that, I'd like to do a quick poll, and Kaushal will lead us through that process. Thanks, Kaushal.
Sure. Thanks. I am going to launch the poll just now for the audience. Okay, I'll just wait for a few more seconds for everybody to vote. Okay. So I'm sharing the results right now. It's pretty interesting. The question is, which reason is the most important? About 21% have voted for the first one, hold individuals and groups accountable. And 17% have voted for manage inventory levels. 63% have voted for improve management of business. So those are the three categories.
Great. Very interesting results. It's actually fairly closely in line with what I would expect. Heavily showing how improving the business, and I'm pleased to see that because the way I look at it is very similar. I I think that if I were to pick, I'm cheating to some degree. I'm picking two of them, and that would be the manage inventory levels and improve the management of business. So I'd like to take just a couple minutes here and kind of dig into each of those areas. So first, with respect to managing inventory levels, one of the things that a demand planner has to grapple with in predicting the future is looking at demand variability, knowing that what happens in the future is typically not going to be a flat line or a steady trend, but rather it's going to have fluctuations, and there's always going to be some degree of error. The question really is how much. And so one of the things that a planner needs to do is determine how much safety stock to carry to buffer against the demand fluctuations. And for those of us with our APIC certifications, you recall the basics of the variable demand and the need to carry extra stock to ride out those demand spikes. Usually the conventional wisdom has been, well, carry enough buffer inventory to handle those demand fluctuations. But I would ask the question, what if the demand variability is predictable? If you knew that you're going to have an upturn in demand and you could predict that, then you can plan for that in what you buy or what you make in terms of your manufacturing. And then you don't have to carry safety stock as much if it's predictable. So the real question here is, for if you can be highly accurate in your forecasting, then you should be able to reduce the amount of inventory that you carry. So the question is, can you differentiate between what is predictable demand variability and unpredictable demand variability? Well, at first glance, it might seem like, oh, that's pretty tough. But what I'm saying is, if you can measure forecast accuracy, then yes, you can determine what is the predictable versus unpredictable. And if your forecast accuracy is very strong, then your variability is predictable. So let's keep going through this and carry that forward. But that's one premise that I have, is that you should be able to realize a benefit in reduced safety stock if you have more accurate forecasts. So in terms of improving the management of the business, and most of us felt that this was an important objective, and I completely agree with that. The questions that we should be asking ourselves are, what are we trying to accomplish by measuring accuracy, and what are we trying to improve? So again, what are we trying to improve? So many of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, what are we trying to get out of this accuracy measurement? So, for example, if we measure forecast accuracy at a very high level, say as a family level or as a business group, and we do it using the most recent forecast values, that is, if we just we completed the month of April, and so we look at our forecast that we generated in April for the month of April, we're probably going to, on average, we're going to see accuracy metrics that look better than if we had done it at a more granular level or using a forecast that was created earlier than the month we're measuring. And so why not do that? It certainly would make us look better. Well, the reason for not doing that is that we're not trying to look good. We should be trying to improve the business. And so these are some key decisions that we're going to come back to in this presentation. But I just want to stress that our error, or the deviation between the plan and actual, may be small, but that's not the way to go. We need to really look at how we improve on our business. And if we really are improving on our business, there are a number of forecast accuracy benefits. The better we are at predicting the future, the less we're going to have in the case of excess inventory, the less occurrences we're going to have, or the fewer occurrences of lost opportunities. So in this kind of traditional supply-demand graph, where we see that in the case of supply being greater than demand, we're probably going to see an increase in inventory, and that's dollars that are tied up, dollars or euros or it's your money that's tied up in that that inventory. Conversely, if we have too little supply, then we don't have what we need in order to realize the potential sales, and that's a problem too. So ideally, by measuring forecast accuracy, we're going to be able to get a smaller deviation between these two curves. And that's going to help us to improve customer service levels because we're able to get stuff out on time and have available to sell what those customers need, and they don't go somewhere else. So we increase our sales, reduce the amount of inventory that we have to carry. We improve our cash flow projections. We become much more predictable. Production smoothing, meaning we're able to level load the operations and reduce operating costs, reduce our employee costs, and ultimately we're increasing our return on investment. So there's a lot to be gained by measuring forecast accuracy and using that to improve our forecasts. So let's take a look at some of the examples of forecast accuracy measures. And a few of them that I've captured here include the MAD, which is the mean absolute deviation, or in other words, the average of the errors. Root mean square error, which essentially gives more weight to the larger errors. So for items that have a big deviation, they're going to play a much more significant role in this calculation. MAPE, which is the mean absolute percent error. So that is the average of percent errors. And as I mentioned before, we're going to look at the details of that one in just a moment. The weighted MAPE, or some people call it WAPE, is the weighted average of the absolute percent errors. MAD over mean is a simple calculation. It gives the same result as the weighted MAPE. It's just another way to calculate that. And finally, bias, which is the tendency to over or under forecast. And not to pick on salespeople, but one example is that salespeople are often accused of either being sandbaggers or pie-in-the-sky optimists. And bias is something that can help us track whether a person or a group has a certain pattern of forecasting too high or too low. That is, it doesn't track the magnitude of the error, but just whether the error was that the forecast was higher or lower than the actual results. So if we have a tendency of 90% of our forecasts are under the actual, then we know that there appears to be a tendency for that individual or group to be estimating low, and that's going to be potentially problematic, even though they may be able to come through with actuals that are 90% of the time are higher than the plan. That's not good, because we need to be able to manage the operations and the whole business to a plan that we all have faith that's going to be achievable and accurate. So this time, let's take another quick poll. This will be the second of our two polls. So I'll let Kaushal take this one.
Sure. So the poll is now open for everybody to vote. Okay, so I am going to share the results now. Interesting results. 11% have voted for MAD or root mean squared. 52% have voted for MAPE or weighted MAPE. 7% for bias, 19% for something else, and 11% say they don't do anything. They say none. So I'm going to just close this and pass the presentation back to you.
Great, great. Thanks, Kaushal. Well, that's interesting, and that aligns with our view. We look at MAPE and weighted MAPE as two of the more common methods of measuring forecast accuracy, and for that reason, I wanted to dig a little deeper into these two calculations, the MAPE and the weighted MAPE, and so we'll go through that briefly here. What in terms of how those two are calculated. So, and I recognize that this is maybe remedial for some people, but I've found that even at the executive level, that there are people who are using the MAPE calculations as a means of measuring forecast accuracy, but may never have gone through the details of how it's calculated. And one of the things to take out of this is not just the understanding of how it's calculated, but how it can also be manipulated by people who are trying to make their own personal numbers look good. And we all want to look good. There's nothing wrong with that, except if it's at the expense of providing meaningful information to the organization with which to improve. So let's take a look at how MAPE is calculated. So what is MAPE? The definition is that it's the mean absolute percent error, which means it's the summation of all of the absolute percent error values divided by the total number of instances. And the weighted MAPE takes all of those MAPE values and then multiplies them by a ratio of the volume for that particular item. So if there are 10 items and a particular item represents 40% of the total, then it would get a more heavy weighting within the weighted MAPE calculation. So let's take a walk through a brief example, and this is pretty basic. So let's talk about the error. So the error is very simply the difference between the actual and the forecast. So if our actual was 100 and the forecast was 90, then clearly the error is a difference of 10. In this case, we haven't adjusted it yet because we're saying that it's the forecast minus actual, which is negative 10. But we want to measure the absolute value of that, and the reason for that is that we are interested in how far off were we from the actual, and we don't want negatives and positive deviations to cancel each other out. So we're going to convert everything to the absolute error and measure how far off were we on each one of the deviations. So once we've converted that to the absolute value, what we want to calculate next is the percent error. So the percent error takes that absolute value that we had just created and divides it by the actual. So in our example, 10 divided by 100. That gives us 10%. So we can extend that example into a case where we have 10 separate SKUs, and they all roll up to a particular family. So we'll call that family A. So you can see that for each of these, we've listed the actual, forecast, the error, the absolute error, and the percent error. We can take each of these 10% errors, add them up, divide by 10, so we're getting the average, and that's our MAPE value. So in this case, we have a MAPE of 30.5%. We can use that to summarize the MAPE for these 10 items measured at the item level, or the stock keeping unit. Another way of measuring forecast accuracy would be to do the same calculation, but do it for the one item where we have aggregated all of the values of those 10 items together under family A. So in this case, we have a deviation of 30 with a total actual of 1,436. That gives us a percent error of 2.1%. Now, the average of one value is still the same value, so we can say that our MAPE is 2.1%. Well, that's very different than the MAPE that we got for measuring each individual item out of the 10. And that's fairly typical. In fact, it's very typical that when we're measuring forecast accuracy at a higher aggregate level, that we're going to tend to see lower MAPE values. So it's a pretty critical decision to make, and we'll come back to that. So let's look at the next iteration where we're looking at the weighted MAPE value. So the weighted MAPE value calculates things differently, where it says, well, I'm going to multiply each one of these MAPE values or the percent error values by the weighting of the volume in units for each of these 10 SKUs. So for example, in SKU number 4, we see that its actual volume is quite a bit higher than the other one. So it's going to get a more substantial weight. So its contribution to the overall calculation is higher than the other ones, versus something that had very little contribution, which is item number 5. It only had an actual of 1. So even though its percent error is very high, its contribution is low. So we can see that the weighted MAPE across these items is quite a bit lower than the MAPE value. So that weighted MAPE was 5%. 5% is, in fact, if you're into the calculations, the sum of these 10 values here. Now, what would be the weighted MAPE for family A? Well, it's still going to be 2.1% because we still only have one item. So if we're weighting it, it doesn't change anything. So in a way, we know that for any one item, a weighted MAPE and a MAPE are going to be equal to each other. Okay. So let's take a little what-if scenario and say, well, for that item number 5, let's say that instead of it being a 1-unit actual, that it was 2 units. So in this case, it's only a difference, only a change of 1 unit, but it can have a pretty dramatic effect on the MAPE calculation. So we'll see in this calculation where we had been showing a 2% error, we now show a 50% error. Well, when we calculate the MAPE value, it goes down to 15.5%. So a very significant change in the MAPE statistic, even though all we did was change the actuals by 1 unit. Whereas the weighted MAPE had a much more subtle change, went from 5% to 4.9%. So something to be very aware of if you have significant differences in the number of actuals across items, which is common. There are certain items that may be your workhorse items that really create a lot more demand, and other items that have much less volume. So that's where the MAPE can be more misleading, and why I would suggest that the weighted MAPE, in most cases, the weighted MAPE is going to be a better measure of accuracy. Let's take another example. Let's say that if our actuals for item number 5 was 0 instead of 1. Again, it's only a 1-unit change, but it has a pretty interesting impact. Well, in our calculation, if we recall that for MAPE we're dividing by the actuals. In this case, if the actual is 0, we have a problem because our formula is dividing by 0. That's going to create an error. So we need to decide what to do about that to avoid the error. A lot of times companies will set the value to 0. But in this case, or any case where we're setting that value to 0, it's misleading, because 0 really should represent that the deviation between forecast and actual was nothing, that you were exactly spot on, exactly accurate. But that's not true. In this case, we see that the forecast was some non-zero value, and the actual was 0. So one thing to be aware of and careful about is if you have significant number of items where the actuals are 0 but the forecast is non-zero, then you need to be looking at how much of an impact is that having on your MAPE calculation. Now again, if you use the weighted MAPE, this falls out and it's a non-issue, because the weighted MAPE is not going to give any weighting to something that has 0 actual value. Okay? So that's really the basics of calculating MAPE. Now, let's take a look at some of the key considerations that I think we all should be aware of and thinking about as we develop and manage the forecast accuracy measurement process. So first, let's talk about what's the difference between an error and accuracy. So a lot of times when companies talk about what is they were 90% accurate. Well, what they're really doing most of the time is they're saying 1 minus the MAPE or 1 minus the WAPE value. So, for example, if the MAPE value is 25%, then we'd call out forecast accuracy of 75%. If the MAPE is 100%, then the forecast accuracy is 0%. Sounds pretty bad, but that can happen, especially at low-level items or ones with very small small volume, like we saw before, where we had a forecast of 1 and or a forecast of 3 and actual of 1. You can have a forecast accuracy, or I'm sorry, a MAPE value of 200%. So the point here is that be aware that if you're making this conversion to forecast accuracy, that you need to be aware if you have examples of MAPE that are greater than 100%, you're going to lose visibility of what that true error was. So in those cases, it's probably better to keep your focus on the MAPE value so you can see, was it really 100% MAPE or 400% MAPE? Okay, let's look at the next consideration, and that is regarding the aggregation level. So as we noted earlier, if we group items to the family level, like we saw in our example for family A, we're going to see potentially a lower MAPE value and weighted MAPE value than if we do 10 separate SKUs and then average them to show our metric. And so one might think, well, let's just show at the higher level, probably easier to calculate, fewer items to worry about, and our numbers are going to look better. But again, I ask, what are you trying to improve? So if, in fact, you're trying to plan, for example, your manufacturing and what materials they need to buy or what items they need to produce, you need to be looking at a product mix forecast or SKU level forecast as opposed to a family or product line forecast. And you really ought to be measuring forecast accuracy at the level in which you're trying to use that forecast. So again, that's a really key point. It's important to measure your forecast accuracy at the level at which you're going to use that forecast. If you're trying to use it for marketing purposes and you really just need to know about a product line, then it's quite appropriate to measure it at the more aggregate level. But if you measure it at that more aggregate level and then try to improve and use that forecast to improve your mix forecast, your product mix or SKU forecast, you're losing a lot of important information because you've grouped a lot of items that may have deviations, but they cancel each other out. Okay, so next let's talk about time buckets. So one of the things that companies can do is measure forecast accuracy in months or quarters or in a rolling 3-month sum. And some of the considerations there are that you need to think about, some companies have kind of a hockey stick effect where in the third month of a quarter they have significantly higher shipments, and so they want to be able to get rid of that variability of month to month and group it all together in a quarter. And that may be appropriate, but just be sure you know what you're giving up, because what you're giving up is that you may not have the granularity of being able to look at the variations from month to month and being able to see what that MAPE value is that you're truly missing. So in this particular example, we see that the MAPE in a month-to-month view is 9.2%, but if we group all of the data into a quarterly number, then we're down to 1.8%. Very different numbers, and even though our forecasts and our sales it's the same data, we're coming up with a different answer based on how we group that information. Now let's take a look at one of the key considerations that relates to what we call lag or offset. So when we use this forecast, we need to talk about what forecast are we using. Are we using the forecast that was created most recently, or a month ago, 3 months ago? And I would say that the forecast that you should use should be the one that's appropriate for the time that you're going to be making a decision. For example, if your production lead time is 3 months, so you need to commit to the raw materials in advance, you need to commit to your labor, you need to make commitments about what you're going to be producing, then a forecast that's provided to you for the current month, in the current month, doesn't provide you much value. You've already locked into what you're going to be doing. But a forecast that's provided to you 3 months in advance is of value to you. That's the critical thing that you're going to be using. Now, there's nothing magical about 3 months. I use that as an example, but it's really dependent on your particular business and what your overall lead times are, and when you need that forecast in order to make your critical decisions. And it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to manufacturing and operations. It could be for doing marketing strategy, making promotional plans. Whatever it is that you're trying to measure, that's going to determine what is your lead time and what should your offset be. So I'll tell you a quick story. I met a salesperson who was very aware of how his company measured forecast accuracy. They used the most recent forecast and compared that to actual. So he changed his forecast at the end of each month to match the actuals to date, plus a little bit more for the last remaining day or two. And his forecast accuracy measure was phenomenal, which should be no surprise because he was just locking in what he knew at the end of each month. So that's, when you think about it, it's pretty darn silly. It doesn't benefit anybody in the company other than that one individual. So again, we ask ourselves, what are we trying to improve? That method wasn't improving anything. So we need to make sure that we're measuring our forecast accuracy using a forecast that was created that we could actually do something with. So the example that I'm showing here at the bottom of the screen is one way of doing it. In this particular method, this client of ours was looking at, they wanted to group all of their actuals for a particular quarter and measure that. So if they were in month 1 of the current quarter, then we would measure the actuals. We'd have the complete picture of the actuals for the previous quarter, and we'd want to compare the actuals to the forecast that was created in month 2 of the previous quarter. So let's take an example. Let's say that the previous quarter here is equal to July, August, and September. So we're going to use the forecast that was created in May. And that forecast, it was created in May for the months of July, August, and September is what we compare when we get out beyond that. So when we get out to October, we could make this measurement and see what was the forecast accuracy for that July, August, September quarter. Another way to look at forecast accuracy is in month-by-month view. So I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but those familiar with waterfalls will recognize this. On one axis we have the period that we're trying to forecast, and on the vertical axis we have the month in which we generated that forecast. So if I were to look, for example, in November here, and I was forecasting for February, I would see my value of 130 that was a forecast for February created in the month of November, and that represents an offset of 3 months. Versus if I were looking at that same February period, forecast period, but I created my forecast in February, the same month, that would equate to a 0 forecast. Well, we can measure the accuracy with any of these offsets. So if you look at each of the blue ones, that's our zero offset, and we can see that in the bottom table in the row where it says offset 0. In theory, we should be able to have a better forecast where our offset is 0 or 1 than if our offset is 2 or 3. So what are we trying to get at by doing that? Why not just measure it at 0 offset? Well, I already said that it's not very useful information if you can't do anything with it. So you need to really focus in on what is the offset that's meaningful for your business. And then one of the benefits to looking at, does the accuracy improve as you get closer to your actual period? If there's a significant improvement, it's worth asking the question, what information did we have as we got into the nearer term that helped us to be more accurate? And can we get to that information sooner in the process? Can we get that information out at 2 months or 3 months offset? What did we know early in the very near term? Some things are just not very predictable. If, for example, a customer had a fire in their warehouse and burned a lot of their inventory, and they need to replenish that inventory, and they've come back to you and asked for a special order, and it's a big demand, there's no way that anyone could have predicted that that was going to happen. And so there's nothing much you can do about that. But if it's something that could have been known through either better communication, better forecasting tools, something that you look back and you say, the reason that our actuals and our forecasts were different, we could have known that 3 months ahead of time, but we didn't capture that, and we didn't provide that information to the people who needed it. And that's really the key. Can you improve your process by getting the information to the people who need it in a very timely basis? So let's keep moving forward. One additional area of consideration is units versus revenue. So in this case, we most often are measuring forecast accuracy in units, but it doesn't have to be that way. It may be more meaningful to look at revenue, especially if your average selling prices vary considerably. So that is, if there are certain items that carry a much higher price tag than others, it's going to be useful to be able to look at those and weight by that dollar volume as opposed to units. And in a lot of those cases, it may be quite beneficial to do both the units and revenue weighting. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you're going to measure in revenue, I don't mean to pick on sales all the time, but I'll use this example as well. Sales tends to be very focused on forecasting in revenue, and they tend to be less comfortable forecasting in unit quantities, especially at a detail level, such as the product SKU level. So we want to do, and for measuring forecast accuracy in revenue, we want to be careful not to let them off the hook for providing accurate product forecasts, because in the end, S&OP depends on collaborative planning and measuring the accuracy there. So you need to enable various functional groups to plan in their logical units of measure. So for the sales group in revenue, that's more comfortable for them. We want to allow them to plan in that, but also bring together the units and the revenue to drive to a consensus plan. So measuring forecast accuracy in both units and revenue may be a smart way to encourage that collaboration, make it easier for them to engage and provide their valuable inputs. And that's true not only for sales, but for marketing, for finance. There are other groups that are focused on revenue numbers more so than units. But we need it all to come together into one consensus plan, or what we call the one number plan. But the one number plan may be expressed in units. We also need to express that one number in revenue. So let's take a moment to take a look at some examples of some forecast accuracy reports. So this is a report that we generated out of Steel Wedge, and it allows the users to see the actual values, the forecast values, in this case called out as constrained plan, the MAPE values, and also see the bias values. This calculates the difference between the actuals and the forecast, and most importantly, whether it was above or below. We can then also look at it, the total MAPE values, and show the weighted value and the not weighted value. The bias, in this case, we're showing that 83% of the time in this example, that the forecast was higher than the actual. So that's pretty significant, and if we were to see that in real life, we would say, there's probably something that ought to be analyzed to figure out why we're seeing a significant over forecasting. If it happens in one period, maybe it's just an event. But if it consistently happens period over period, then it's something that's worth looking into to see if there are changes that need to be made, or to help educate people about the impact of their forecasts. So again, the trend is something that's very important to follow. Is this an event, or is this a consistent pattern? And one of the things that's very nice for those who have Excel 2010, you may have noticed there's a feature called slicers, and it allows you to do a more traditional pivot table kind of view, but very quickly be able to click on the pivot items and get a quick view and quick recalculation based on that subset of data. It can be very powerful to quickly be able to see where do I have areas that need more analysis. And another way to look at measuring performance and forecast accuracy is to do it by functional group. So in this case, we can measure the forecast accuracy, or MAPE values, for each of these groups. In this case, our consensus, our sales manager, marketing, demand planning, statistical forecast. So we can see where are we accurate, where are we inaccurate, where do we have the biggest need for us to improve the way we're doing things. If the consensus plan, the MAPE value is higher than some other group that's significantly lower, maybe there's something that group is doing that we should take into consideration and change the way we ultimately achieve our consensus plan. So this is a good way of going back and determining where there are opportunities for us to improve the ultimate collaborative demand plan. So with that, I think we've reached the end of the prepared slides, and so I'll ask Kaushal if there are any questions that have been submitted that we can take a shot at answering.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Rick. We had a number of questions that came in advance of the webinar as well as during the webinar today. So let's use the next 10 minutes to try and address as many of those as we can. It's a pretty interesting set of questions. The first question I think I should ask you is this one. Our demand planners consistently are bombarded with questions about SKU level forecast changes. How do we improve forecast accuracy at the SKU level when there are hundreds of SKUs per product family?
Yeah. If you have hundreds of SKUs per product family, the inclination might be, well, let's just simplify the way we're doing our accuracy measures and do it at a family level. But as we talked about earlier, it's important to forecast, to measure forecast accuracy at the SKU level if you're forecasting at that level and you're using that SKU level forecast to project your needs for raw materials or manufacturing. So what I would suggest is you sort your SKUs by the weighted MAPE, then pick the top 10 highest weighted MAPE SKUs and analyze each SKU by asking the question I've been saying all along, which is, why was the actual result different from the forecast, and how can we improve that? And if you do that every month and you attack those biggest weighted MAPE items, hopefully they drop out of your top 10, and overall you're going to improve your forecast accuracy.
Perfect. So here's another question. Are there any benefits to measuring MRP accuracy? What would be the best KPI to measure, how accurate your components level forecast to your build plan?
Okay. So MRP is Material Requirements Planning, and that is basically using a forecast of independent items to drive the requirements for the dependent parts or components. So the dependent parts have a bill of material structure, and we know what to buy on the basis of that independent forecast. So I'd say if the linkage between the forecast and MRP is defined by a fixed bill of material structure, there's really no benefit to measuring the forecast accuracy for the dependent parts, because they're always going to refer back up to the independent part that's driving their demand. So that forecast error can be attributed entirely to the independent items, and you can forecast, or you can focus your measuring of accuracy on those independent items only. The one exception to that, I would say, is that if you have dependent items that vary, that is, that their attach rates are not fixed, you don't have a fixed bill of material where someone might, for example, select certain components to add in. For example, in a laptop, they might pick the amount of memory or certain other features. In that case, you might want to, you probably should be considering using a planning tool that's designed to handle attach rate planning, which is something that Steel Wedge offers.
Fantastic. The third question is, how to measure forecast accuracy for a project-based business?
Project-based businesses, they're challenging in that they tend to be more, intermittent. You don't have as much consistency of demand, and so because they have more intermittent demand, you may see more actual periods where there's zero, and as we mentioned before, that's a problem for the MAPE calculation. So it may be advantageous to use a longer time horizon, such as quarters rather than months, and you'll probably need to pay close attention to those periods where there are zero actuals. But it can be done. It's just you need to be more careful because of the intermittent nature of that demand.
Fantastic. The other question that came in is, is it better to calculate MAPE at low level like SKU versus a business group?
Yeah. So, well, we covered that one. I'd say the answer really depends on what you're trying to improve. If you want to make a better forecast for buying raw materials or your manufacturing of specific items, then the SKU level is really going to be the most appropriate. But if you're looking to improve your marketing forecast for say a product line, then the higher level of aggregation is probably going to be better. So ultimately, it comes down to what are you trying to plan for, what are you executing to, and that's the level at which you really should be measuring your accuracy.
Okay. The next one is, what's the best way to save forecasts from previous months?
Yeah, this is something in terms of having the data to calculate your forecast. You need to have saved forecasts in the past. If you're going to be doing an offset or lag timing, which is very important, I believe, then you need to have saved those forecasts and relate them to the specific periods you're forecasting, which is that offset. So I know in Steel Wedge what we do is we archive the forecasts each period so that it's in the database, it's available to do those accuracy reports that we were looking at. You're able to do that across multiple historical periods. So you got to have some way to capture and retain those forecasts in each period.
Okay. So the other question is, can it be possible to have a bigger MAPE when at a higher aggregation level?
Yeah, I've seen that happen in cases where the lower level had a lot of zero actual values, and the zero values triggered that 0% MAPE value for those periods. That was the example that we were looking at before. And if the MAPE calculation is converting anything with an actual of 0 to a 0 MAPE value, so that becomes a problem. So ultimately, if there were enough zero actual periods to drive that overall MAPE value much lower, you're better off really either going to a higher level of aggregation or using a grouping across periods, like going from months to quarters, or and probably the best option is to use a weighted MAPE, so that impact of those zero periods is going to be very minimal.
Perfect. I'm just going to take one more question now. And this is a pretty interesting question, actually. It says, what is the right mix of human insight, statistics, collaboration for my industry? Where can I find more info on best practices?
Well, so we've been focused on measuring forecast accuracy as the feedback loop to improve the S&OP and IB process. So if you take all of those things and you say, we're really embracing the need to improve our business, then what we should be doing is being able to provide information back to the humans and the collaborative process, and we should be able to leverage the people and the technology to drive a continually improving consensus plan. This is what we do every day at Steel Wedge. That's our primary focus. And so in terms of where can you find more information on best practices, certainly Steel Wedge is a great place to start. We're happy to share our knowledge in that area from our website and our people. We're very passionate about how do you blend the statistics and the collaboration and the technology to enable people to be more effective in the way they plan.
Fantastic, Rick. Thank you so much again. And we are going to end this webinar now, but a big thank you again to our fantastic presenter, Rick Blair. As I mentioned at the top of the call, we will be sending out a recording in the next couple of days, so look for that in your inbox and be sure to share that with your colleagues. We will also have a follow-up blog post on our website, www.steelwedge.com. We hope you enjoyed this session and continue to join us at our